And I'm the chair of the English department, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Department of English Colloquium on series on literature. This afternoon, though, I'm very pleased to be introducing Dr. Mark Adderley, who is associated with the St. Thomas More Newman Center here at USD. Dr. Adderley did his MA in English at the University of Wales and his PhD in Medieval and Renaissance Literature at the University of South Florida. His dissertation was on structure and genre in William Langland's Piers Plowman. And Dr. Adderley, come on in, has published academic essays on varied topics within the field of medieval and Renaissance literature, including on Beowulf, on oral traditions, on the Morte d'Arthur, on Chrétien de Troyes, and on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So a nice array of sort of the highlights of medieval literature there. Dr. Adderley has held faculty positions at various universities, including the Georgia Institute of Technology, Missouri Valley College, Wyoming Catholic College, and most recently at Mount Marty College. And Dr. Adderley's talk today is titled, and this matches that, excellent, An Antidote to Violence, Sacred and Profane Violence in Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adderley.
On July 6, 1940, T.H. White, the author of The Once and Future King, wrote to his Cambridge mentor and close friend, L.J. Potts, "I have suddenly discovered that the central theme of Morte d'Arthur is to find an antidote to war." Now, this is a bit of an exaggeration. White was a pacifist, and he seems to have been projecting his own anxieties back onto a text from the distant past. But if you were to rephrase it slightly and say instead, the central theme of the Morte d'Arthur is to find an antidote to violence, then it does start to make some sense. I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the Morte d'Arthur, looking at how Malory presents violence, and finish by attempting to fit this theme into a framework provided by the late French anthropologist René Girard, whose work on sacred and profane violence and the scapegoating mechanism has been seminal. Malory completed the Morte d'Arthur, an English prose text, in 1470, telling the story of King Arthur from his conception. Oh, that's better. You get the widescreen version, but portrait version of the land. No, never mind. Malory completed the Morte d'Arthur, an English prose text, in 1470, telling the story of King Arthur from his conception to the deaths of Guinevere, his wife, and Lancelot, his best friend. It exists in two early versions. One is a manuscript discovered in 1934, which was either copied from Malory's autograph or more likely from an intermediary, sometime between 1470, when Malory died, and 1485, when William Caxton, England's earliest printer, published his version of the text, with considerable differences from the manuscript version. Although the Morte d'Arthur is his commonly accepted title, Malory actually names it on the last page of his book, the whole book of King Arthur and of his noble knights of the Round Table, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we're going to stick with Morte d'Arthur. One of the first books printed in England, it has remained popular ever since. Here's how Queen Elizabeth's tutor, Queen Elizabeth I's tutor, that is, Roger Ascham, described it in 1570. "In our forefathers' time, few books were read in our tongue, saving certain books of chivalry. As one, for example, Morte d'Arthur, the whole version of which book standeth in two special points, in open manslaughter and bold bawdry. Yet I know when God's Bible was banished the court and Morte d'Arthur received into the prince's chamber." I really wish someone would review one of my books like that. I mean, I know it was attempting to discourage people from reading it, but it evidently didn't work. Generations of readers have subsequently loved the Morte d'Arthur, often for the very reasons Ascham condemns it. Everything medieval went through a temporary eclipse during the Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment, but new editions of Malory in 1816 and 1817, very close together there, assured the devotion of generations of readers. Sir Walter Scott, in his introduction to Marmion, recommended Le Morte d'Arthur. The general reader, he wrote, will gain, quote, an excellent idea, sorry, I'll do the right voice, an excellent idea of what romances of chivalry were. It has also the merit of being written in pure Old English, and many of the wild adventures which it contains are told with a simplicity bordering on sublime. Sir Robert Southey wrote that Le Morte d'Arthur has been my delight since I was a schoolboy. It has inspired artists like Sir Edward Burne-Jones and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Most importantly for literary historians, Alfred Lord Tennyson drew largely from the Morte d'Arthur for his Idylls of the King. Not exclusively, he also used the Welsh Mabinogion, which is one of the most wonderful books ever written, apart from the Morte d'Arthur. The 20th century gave us most notably Charles Williams' Arthurian poetry, Taliesin through Logos, and the Region of the Summer Stars, but also T.H. White's novel The Once and Future King, Rosemary Sutcliffe's attempt to reconstruct the supposed historical Arthur, Sword at Sunset, Mary Stuart's trilogy focusing on Merlin, The Crystal Cave, The Hollow Hills, and The Last Enchantment, and Marion Bradley's neo-pagan retelling of the story The Mists of Avalon, not to mention a large number of movies focusing on King Arthur. And it's a statement of the quality of those movies that these are the three that I think are the best of the bunch. Not that I've got any arguments against Monty Python, and Excalibur's a guilty pleasure because it's so cheesy and early 80s, but come on. Can't we do better than... No, never mind. Tangent. So, here's how Malory's book begins. It befell in the days of Uther Pendragon, when he was king of all England and Sorraine, that there was a mighty duke in Cornwall, that held war against him long time, and the duke was called the Duke of Tunisia. And so by means, King Uther sent for this duke, charging him to bring his wife with him. For she was called a fair lady and passing wise, and her name was called Igraine. Now Uther is not a good king. He attempts to seduce Igraine, but she is virtuous and warns her husband. The two of them ride away together at the dead of night, hotly pursued by Uther and his men, who lay siege to their two castles in Cornwall. One castle is called Terrible, and that's where the Duke is. The other is called Tintagel, and that's where Igraine is. This is Tintagel Castle today. A lot of Tintagel Castle was actually built in the Victorian era, rather than actually in the Middle Ages. I don't know why they felt comfortable doing that. They must not have had a national trust or anything at the time. Society for the preservation of this and that. Uther invests the castle, but he cannot get to Igraine. He asks for the advice of Merlin, who offers to use his magic in a subterfuge. If Uther will give him the child born of his union with Igraine, he will see to it that the king lie with her that very night. Naturally, Uther agrees. And Merlin transforms him into the likeness of the Duke of Tintagel. Thus, Uther sneaks inside the castle and lies with Igraine, who thinks he is her husband. However, her husband has in fact already been killed in a skirmish with Uther's men, so that's okay then. Arthur, when he's born, is at least not illegitimate. That perhaps should give us some pause. Arthur's idyllic reign begins with an act of rape, our first act of violence. The Arthurian legend, you see, is really all about sin. Sin, the price of sin, and redemption from sin. But it has to begin with sin. Merlin hides the baby Arthur, Uther dies, and the realm, without an heir, plummets once more into warfare and anarchy. As Malory writes, then stood the realm in great jeopardy long while. For every lord that was mighty of men marred him strong, and many wend to have been king. Malory is describing the politico-military situation of his own day. War was the normal situation for most of the Middle Ages, but in 1470, England was enduring a particularly destructive conflict, the Wars of the Roses. These wars began when Henry IV acceded to the throne by forcing his predecessor, Richard II, to abdicate. Richard subsequently died, mysteriously in prison. England divided itself into two houses, the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. This is a very complicated conflict, made worse by the fact that everybody seems to recall either Edward or Richard, except for Roger Mortimer, who seems to have been two people. I'm not making this up. Shakespeare was confused by this, and he wrote 8 plays about it. What's really important about this period of English history is that it was a period of lawlessness. The battles occurred infrequently, but the king had to focus on them and on the political machinations of his enemies. Consequently, he was totally ineffectual in enforcing the laws, and into this vacuum leapt those barons who had the power to enforce their own wills, whom Malory notes when to have been king. One of these barons was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, not Warwick, you Americans. That's how we can tell you're Americans when you come over to England, because you say, I'd like to go to Warwick, please. It's Warwick. Actually, just read George Bernard Shaw, and he makes fun of the way it's pronounced by French. Never mind. One of these barons was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as Warwick the Kingmaker. What a great name that is, love to be called that. Warwick began the Wars of the Roses as a supporter of the Lancastrian faction. However, one dispute after another caused him to switch sides multiple times, supporting one rival claimant then another, until he was killed at the Battle of Barnet. No wonder if he knew whose side was on even then. Malory, a follower of the Earl of Warwick, seems to have resembled in some ways the robber barons he describes in his book. According to his enemies, he was guilty of a number of crimes. In 1450, he ambushed the Duke of Buckingham, a rival of Warwick the Kingmaker, and 19 other men. In the following year, he extorted 120 shillings in 2 incidents and robbed the house of Hugh Smith of Monk's Kirby. He was also accused of raping Smith's wife, Joan, on 2 separate occasions. Now, rape in the 15th century did not imply non-consensual sex, it actually means theft. However, so it could refer to kidnapping. However, the fact that it occurred on 2 separate occasions and that the charges were preferred by Hugh and not by Joan also implies a measure of, well, maybe consent on Joan's part. Malory also dabbled in horse stealing and highway robbery. What a nice chap. Before long, he was apprehended and imprisoned without trial at Marshalsea Prison in London. This is an 18th century picture of him. And later at Newgate. He spent the rest of his life in and out of prison, usually according to the whim of the current king. And it was during his stay in prison, with access to what seems to have been a perfectly adequate library, that Malory wrote what the book that we now know as the Morte d'Arthur. Periodically, through this book, he refers to his imprisonment and complains about his unfair treatment. And he concludes it, I pray you all, gentlemen and gentlewomen, that read this book of Arthur and his knights, from the beginning to the ending, pray for me, while I am and live, that God send me good deliverance, and when I am dead, I pray you all pray for my soul. Back to the story. Then Merlin went to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and consulted him for to send for all the lords of the realm and all the gentlemen of arms, that they should to London come by Christmas upon pain of curse, and for this cause, that Jesu that was born on that night, that he would of his great mercy so show some miracle, as he was come to be king of mankind, or to show some miracle, who should be rightwise king of this realm. So the Archbishop, by the advice of Merlin, sent for all the lords and gentlemen of arms, that they should come by Christmas, even unto London, and many of them made him plain of her life, that her prayer might be the more acceptable unto God. So in the greatest church of London, whether it were Paulus or not, the French book marketh no mention, all the estates were long or day in the church for to pray. And when matins and the first mass was done, there was saying in the churchyard, against the high altar a great stone foursquare, like unto a marble stone, and in midst thereof was like an anvil of steel, a foot on high, and therein stuck a fire sword, naked by the point, and letters were written in gold about the sword, that said thus, Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England. Of course, we know what happens. All the knights of the realm failed to draw the sword from the stone, but Arthur, seeking a sword to replace his brother's, which he lost, draws it successfully and is proclaimed king. Naturally, the barons object to these rather unconventional means of transitioning political power, and he has to fight them, but eventually he is crowned king, and then Arthur gets married. Merlin warns him not to marry Guinevere. She's going to be bad news. But he's madly in lust. Remember his father's behaviour? At his wedding feast, Arthur is either told about or else actually witnesses a series of failures of justice. His response, amazingly, is indifference. I may not do therewith, he says. Now this comment sends Merlin into a passion. Nay, said Merlin, you may not lay it so, this adventure, so lightly, for these adventures must be brought to an end, or else it will be disworship to you in your face. The adventures end badly. One knight neglects a woman in peril, who subsequently dies and turns out to be his own daughter. Gawain, swearing to the knight Sir Pelleas that he will win the love of Lady Ettarde for him, actually sleeps with her instead. Worse, in the middle of a single combat with a knight, the knight's lover intervenes and Gawain accidentally kills her. Arthur is appalled, and he makes all his knights swear an oath. Then the king established all his knights, and gave them riches and lands, and charged them never to do outrage nor the Morte, and always to flay treason, and to give mercy unto him that asketh mercy, upon pain of forfeiture of their worship and lordship of King Arthur for evermore, and always to do ladies, damsels, and gentlewomen and widows succour, strengthen them in her rights, and never to enforce them upon pain of death. Also, that no man take no battles in wrongful quarrel, for no love, nay, for no world's goods. Each year, the knights will meet at Pentecost, to the birthday of the church, and swear this oath once more, and so they will be dedicated to justice instead of aggression. They meet at the round table, which had been a wedding gift from Guinevere's father, large enough to seat 150 knights. 2 pi should give you the size of that table. It's probably bigger than this state. Well, maybe New Jersey. When he learns that his daughter is to marry King Arthur, this is what Leondra's, her father, says. As for Melundus, I will give it him, if I wist it might please him. But he hath Lundus enow, he needeth none. But I shall send him the table round, which Uther his father gave me. And when it is fully complete, there is 100 knights and 50. And as for 100 good knights, I have myself, but I want 50, for so many have been slain in my days. Now, Malory is not making this up. There was a strong tradition regarding the round table during the Middle Ages, and he was tapping into that tradition. Malory took his account from the Vulgate cycle, which was written in the early 13th century in a Cistercian monastery somewhere in France. In the Vulgate cycle, Arthur's round table is constructed by Merlin in imitation of a table built by Joseph of Arimathea, who, according to legend, brought the Holy Grail to Britain. The Grail would feed those sitting at the table with whatever food they desired. The authors of the Vulgate cycle took their account from a similar account by a French poet, Robert de Boron, who died in 1212. Robert described Arthur as sitting at the round table with his 12 peers, like Charlemagne in the Chanson de Roland. Robert in turn took his account of the round table from another French poet named Wass. Keeping up with this? So as clear as is the summer's sun. Never mind, intro. Here's what Wass wrote of the origin of the round table. Arthur, he wrote in French, this is a translation. Arthur constructed the Round Table, of which the Bretons tell great tales. The vassals took their places there, all chivalrous, all equal to. They sat at dinner equally, and they were served there equally. None of these men were able to boast that he sat higher than his peer. All were seated equally. So, in this early account, the Round Table is a means Arthur uses for disposing of arguments about precedence. In a kind of medieval spirit of democracy, all are seated equally at the Round Table, no one nearer the head than anyone else. Now, in the Middle Ages, there was a tradition that Christ and his disciples ate the Last Supper at a round table. Here's a panel from a high altar in Picardy, France, depicting that scene. At each of these tables, Jesus, Joseph's, and Arthur's, one seat is left free. Originally, this was the seat occupied by the traitor, Judas Iscariot. Later, the seat can be occupied only by the perfect knight, the one who will win the Holy Grail, kind of a redemption of Judas's betrayal. So Arthur's Round Table is a symbol of the most sacred moment in the earthly life of Christ and looks forward to the earthly quest for perfection represented in the Arthurian stories by the quest for the Holy Grail. This is the tradition Malory inherits. For him, the Round Table is a symbol of the justice of Arthur's reign, taking on a quasi-religious significance of its own. Here's what Percival's aunt tells him about the Round Table. There's so many characters in this book, don't worry about who's who, right? Percival, Grail Knight, but minor. Merlin made the Round Table, in tokening of roundness of the world. For men should by the Round Table understand the roundness signified by right. For all the world, Christian and heathen, repaireth unto the Round Table. And when they are chosen to be of the fellowship of the Round Table, they think themselves more blessed and more in worship than they had gotten half the world. And you have saying that they have lost your fathers and your mothers and all your kin and your weavers and your children for to be of your fellowship. Now clearly, Malory here wishes us to recall the words of Jesus in the Gospel of St. Luke. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And Jesus isn't saying here we should disobey the fifth commandment. He doesn't contradict himself. But he is saying that nothing should be more important to his followers than him. We should stop at nothing to follow him. And Malory says this too about the Round Table. That fellowship is the most important thing in the lives of its members. And they, being dedicated to the defense of the weak and welcoming everyone to the table, Christian and heathen, puts forward an agenda for improving the world. What will lead us to utopia is love, for to Malory, fellowship is a type of love, the love between friends. This is Arthur's first attempt to dismantle a cycle of violence that tore apart the realm in his father's day, and which was tearing apart the realm in Malory's own time too. But fellowship, Merlin realizes, is not enough. Percival's aunt continues, when Merlin had ordained the Round Table, he said, by them which should be fellows of the Round Table, the truth of the Saint Grail should be well known. Friendship is the first step. When friends come together, their unity, Merlin argues, will reveal deeper secrets, the spiritual secrets of the Holy Grail. But that lies in the future. For a while, the Morte d'Arthur becomes a bewildering series of tales of individual knights involved in various acts of daring do. One of the most important knights is Sir Gawain. This illustration is from Cotton Nero A10, Sir Gawain the Green Knight. It also contains pearl, cleanness, patience. And I don't remember what else. And this is not a story that Malory relates, alas. Malory presents Gawain as a barbarous knight whose conversion to gentler behaviour is really only skin deep. He even murders a series of knights, culminating in King Bagdemagus during his quest for the Holy Grail, which is a no-no. But he learns from the example of magnanimous knights of the Round Table, particularly Sir Lancelot, and the final chapters of the Morte d'Arthur document his struggle between the two sides of his nature, between what his upbringing has made him and what he aspires to be. Another important knight is Sir Tristram, the confused knight. Assigned to bring back from Ireland a wife for his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall, Tristram accidentally shares a love potion with the bride-to-be. Tristram is always, therefore, in love with the wife of his uncle. Now, since Mark is a cat, Arthur and his knights don't have a hard time choosing sides, but Malory uses the story of Tristram and Isolde to comment on the main love story of the Morte d'Arthur. That is, of course, the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. This illustration is from Pierpont Library 805, folio 67, a manuscript of the French prose Lancelot, one of Malory's sources, and those of you who have read The Divine Comedy will remember from the Inferno that Paolo and Francesca are assigned to hell because of the sin into which they are tempted by reading this scene. It really wasn't worth it, I can tell you. Unlike his French source, Malory is fairly discreet about the love affair of Lancelot and Guinevere. When they are courting Guinevere's bedroom together, Malory writes, "As the French book saith, the Queen and Sir Lancelot were together, and whether they were abed, or at other manner of disporters, may list not thereof make mention, for love that time was not as love is nowadays." I know. Malory's reticence to be specific characterizes his treatment of the situation. It's especially notable when we read this incident as presented by the French book to which Malory refers. At this point in the narrative, the French author writes, "When Lancelot was inside, he locked the door after him. Then he took off his shoes and undressed and climbed into bed with the queen." See, Malory might not list to make mention whether or not there are other manner of passing the time, but it's pretty certain according to the French author, and that's what we'd expect. And this reticence about Lancelot and Guinevere characterizes Malory's presentation of the lovers. Not that there's any doubt about their relationship, but discretion is important for the characters and for the narrator. The court fears rumour, what Malory calls noise, above all other things. Go ahead, jump into bed with the queen, just don't let the king know, or anybody else. But their affair is certainly not platonic. When Elaine, daughter of King Pelles, falls in love with Lancelot, all she has to do to tempt him into bed is pretend to be Guinevere. It's a dark night, and she succeeds. This is an image I found on the internet. I couldn't find any record of the manuscript that it's from. I think it speaks for itself. It describes the morning after scene perfectly, which is one of those masterpieces of comedy. If you read it out loud, if you read it silently, it's like, but read it out loud, and it comes alive, and it's really quite funny. Anyway, I wish I knew where this was from. I mean, maybe it's a forgery, maybe it's not Arthurian. I've never seen it before, but it's just perfect. Anyway, after 9 months after this event, there is another event, the birth of Galahad, the Pure. You can tell he's pure in this 1881 painting by Herbert Gustav Schmaltz, partly because of his complete indifference to the woman in the picture, though, in all fairness, she might be his mother, but mostly because of that outrageous helmet that he's wearing. It's the uniform of the Pure Knight, you see, to wear wings and hair. I've lost my place. Oh, right, here he is again. This time in an 1870 painting by Arthur Hughes, or again. Oops, what did I? Yeah, Galahad is the knight who achieves the Grail by being pure and not killing anybody. In the end, he goes to heaven, leaving nobody behind to be pure and virtuous in Camelot. It's not that the spiritual quest has failed, it's actually succeeded spectacularly well. But its aim is not to solve the problems of the current world. Galahad goes beyond this world and into the next, the goal of every Christian. He leaves the world still in need of a non-violent solution to the problem of unregulated violence. Malory's story is about the present world. He doesn't attempt to describe what's beyond it. And the usual state of the world is that people sin. They tend to fall in love with the wrong person. Tristram is one, Lancelot another, A third would be Meleagant. See, Meleagant appears in the only episode in which the queen is abducted. See, we tend to think that Guinevere is abducted all the time. You know, it happened once in Malory. Meleagant, having kidnapped Guinevere, becomes terrified of Lancelot and ambushes him, killing his horse. Lancelot has to hitch a ride on a cart with a dwarf. Remember the dwarfs from the Fairy Queen not too long ago? Yeah, dwarfs, really important. Small, but important. All of this intensifies Meleagant's terror. But before the lover has arrived on the scene, the queen has already negotiated a truce with her kidnapper. This leads to a scene which I think well illustrates one of Malory's greatest strengths. His ability to handle character as expressed through dialogue, in which he is second in the Middle Ages only to Chaucer. Then the queen and her ladies went down unto Sir Lancelot that stood wroth out of measure in the inner court to abide battle, and ever he said, "Thou traitor knight, come forth!" Then the queen came unto him and said, "Sir Lancelot, why be ye so unmoved?" "Ah, madam," said Sir Lancelot, "why ask ye me that question? For meseemeth ye ought to be more wroth than I am, for ye have the heart and the dishonour, for wit you well, madam, my heart is but little in regard for the slaying of Amara's son, but they despite graveth me much more than all my heart." "Truly," said the queen, "ye say truth, but heartily I thank you," said the queen. "But you must come in with me peaceably, for all thing is put in mine hand, and all that is amiss shall be amended, for the knight full sore repenteth him of this misadventure that is befallen him." "Madam," said Sir Lancelot, "sith it is so that ye be accorded with him, as for me, I may not again say it. Howbeit, Sir Meleagant hath done full shamefully to me and cowardly." "And, madam," said Sir Lancelot, "and I had wist that ye would have been so lightly accorded with him, I would not have made such haste unto you." "Why say ye so?" said the queen. "Do ye forethink yourself of your good deeds?" "Wist you well," said the queen, "I accorded never with him for no favour, nor love that I had unto him, but of every shameful noise of wisdom to lay it on." Noise, notice that word. "Madam," said Sir Lancelot, "ye understand full well I was never willing nor glad of shameful slander nor noise, and there is another king queen named knight that beareth the life, except my lord King Arthur and you, madam, that should let me, but I should make Sir Meleagant heart full cold, or ever I departed from hence." "That wot I well," said the queen, "but what will ye more? Ye shall have all thing ruled as ye list to have it." "Madam," said Sir Lancelot, "so ye be pleased. As for my part, ye shall soon please me." So I find that a delightfully comic scene, and the comic depends on what today we call subtext, at least what in the theatre department we call subtext, which is my meaning of the word. Comes with being married to a theatre major. Lancelot's internal monologue is clear and very different from what he actually says. He's frustrated because, having gone to a lot of trouble to rescue the queen, he finds his talents are no longer required. On the other hand, she, although she knows perfectly well why he is frustrated, maintains a perfect air of reasonability, pretending not to understand why he should be so flustered. The use of the word "madam" increases in irony as the passage proceeds, at first with, "Ah, madam, why ask you me that question?" There's a world of weariness in Lancelot's voice, but he goes on to explain himself in a torrent of monosyllables. "Meseemeth ye ought to be more wrother than I am, for ye have the heart and the dishonour. For wit ye well, madam, my heart is but little in regard for the slaying of Amara's son, but they despite graveth me much more than all my heart." The monosyllables move quickly as Lancelot's temper rises, until he reaches his climax in "my hurt is but little in regard for the slaying of Amara's son," where the two-syllable words slow him down so that Guinevere can fully appreciate the inconvenience and hurt that he says he isn't particularly bothered by. He lingers again over "they despite graveth me." You really want to know that. Then he picks up steam again in the last few words of the sentence. It's almost poetry in its use of rhythm. I'm not sure I'd exactly call it meter. The story proceeds. Meleagant, now thoroughly obsequious, is enthusiastic to entertain such prestigious guests in his castle that night. Of course, they're not married, so he lodges them separately, Guinevere insisting that a guard be stationed outside her room to protect her from Meleagant. But Lancelot's ardour will not be dampened, and he visits her in the night, bending apart the iron bars in her window and climbing through it into her bed. One of the iron bars gashes his hand, like that, and after their lovemaking, the bed is covered with blood. When Meleagant enters Guinevere's chamber the following morning to wake her up, which is a little improper if you ask me, he sees the blood as evidence that she has slept with one of her guards. An accusation that Lancelot can easily and even truthfully refute. Lancelot, of course, kills Meleagant in single combat, and the matter blows over. Most readers experience a little anxiety here. Meleagant was obviously a villain, but he was kind of telling the truth, and Lancelot really killed him on a technicality. Guinevere wasn't sleeping one of her nights, but with Lancelot, who defends her. The idea of defending truth by trial by combat has been tested and proved to be, well, a source of anxiety. Furthermore, Lancelot's love affair with Guinevere is now an open secret. Everybody knows about it, but nobody mentions it. Camelot becomes a place of uncomfortable silence, a place of uneasy secrets. This illustration is not from Malory, but from the Morte the last part of the French Vulgate cycle. In the episode illustrated, Arthur's enemy Morgan Le Fay has imprisoned him in a chamber wherein the paintings on the walls illustrate Lancelot's love for the Queen. Because nobody knows about it. It is actually a secret in the French book. And this is shocking. Arthur's finding out here for the first time that his wife and his best friend are being unfaithful to him. But the point is moot in Malory. As Malory, and Arthur knows in Malory, and he's always known. As the French book saith, the king was full loath that such a noise, right, should be upon Sir Lancelot and his queen. For the king had a daming of it, but it would not hear thereof, for Sir Lancelot had done so much for him, and for the queen so many times, that wit you well, the king loved him passingly well. You see, to be having an affair with the queen, or for the queen to be having an affair, is not only adultery, and therefore a sin, but also treason, a crime against the king, and therefore the realm, and punishable by death. Arthur is safe. The Round Table is safe. The realm is safe, as long as no one brings the behaviour of Lancelot and Guinevere into the light of public scrutiny. And of course, somebody does. It's this decision that plunges the realm back into the anarchy with which the Morte d'Arthur started. The progress of the book is from unsanctioned violence to an attempt to redirect violence and then back to unsanctioned violence. This is the very situation that René Girard, the great French anthropologist who died about 3 years ago, described in his classic study, Violence and the Sacred. Now, there's a totally official tangent at this point, so bear with me. Girard asks the question, why are religious rituals so often based on violence? And he distinguishes between two types of violence, which he calls sacred and profane violence. I haven't put them on the screen because it's like right at the beginning. Remember the big letters at the beginning? Profane or unsanctioned violence is the violence that grows in a community when individuals wish to settle a score with each other. The violence escalates as more and more people are drawn into the conflict, and in the end, it threatens to tear the community apart. This is obviously a terrifying prospect. Sacred violence is designed to place limits upon profane violence so that it does not get out of hand and destroy the community. How is this accomplished? Girard observes that one of the notable features of violence is its ability to be deflected onto a different target. If you've ever had a bad day at work and then gone home to kick the dog or chew the kids out for some triviality, you know exactly what he means. Sacred or ritualistic violence or sacrifice redirects this violence onto a victim that will satisfy both parties in the dispute and so put an end to unsanctioned violence, at least temporarily. Girard goes on to explain that communities typically adopt 3 strategies to limit the effects of this escalating violence. 1, preventive measures in which sacrificial rites divert the spirit of revenge into other channels. 2, the harnessing or hobbling of vengeance by means of compensatory measures, trials by combat, etc., whose curative effects remain precarious. 3, the establishment of a judicial system, the most efficient of all curative procedures. In the Morte d'Arthur, Arthur initially tries method number 1, attempting to redirect the violence of his knights towards other targets. He redirects them towards those who are perpetrating acts of violence, and that's the basis of the Round Table. Arthur can achieve political stability by eliminating the violent elements among his subjects. The problem is that it doesn't work. Using violence to end violence simply leaves the violent around, like Gawain wondering what's wrong with killing King Bagdemagus when he's on the quest for the Holy Grail. The harnessing of violence by trial by combat obviously didn't work, as we saw from the episode with Sir Meliagant. Both of these initial solutions attempt to solve the problem of profane violence by means of sacred violence. Girard's theory is that violence is initially channeled towards an innocent victim, whose elimination satisfies both parties. This can occur because both parties choose to believe a fiction about the victim's culpability. Once this fiction is agreed upon by all parties, the victim can be killed or expelled, and all parties are satisfied, and the community is restored. The problem is that the culpability of the victim is, in fact, always a fiction. This is what Girard has called structural innocence. His guilt is known to be a fiction by all parties, but the admission of its fictitiousness will lead to the ineffectiveness of the sacrificial system as a means of controlling violence. If the victim is truly innocent, his death will not lead to peace and reconciliation, but to more violence as members of the community protest the injustice. Structural innocence means that the victim is innocent of the actual charges brought against him, despite the fact that the fiction of his guilt must be maintained. The problem is that Arthur lives in a Christian society in which the innocent victim has already been sacrificed, revealing the fictitious nature of the charges against him. Sacrificial violence has been broken for Arthur's community. Thus, though Arthur casts around for a victim towards whom he can channel the violence of his knights, he cannot allow his knights to participate in the fiction of the victim's guilt. The victim must really be guilty. The result is the quest, an assigned adventure designed to right a wrong. And the problem is that many knights, like Gawain, don't really understand what's going on. The Grail, of course, is in a way part of the problem. Only the knights who are non-violent can achieve the Grail. This means that the knights who actually understand the function of the quest, the elimination of violence, can achieve the Grail. But they will be translated by the quest to another plane of existence, heaven. Thus, the only knights who remain after the quest for the Grail are those who never really understood the purpose of the quest in the first place. It's time for Arthur to look for another solution. Now again, according to Girard, the origin of violence is mimetic envy. Girard posited that we all borrow our desires from others. Desire for something is always provoked by another person who possesses something that we do not. Thus we have a subject who desires, an object that is desired, and a mediator who possesses that object. The object seems to gain in value in the subject's eyes simply because the mediator appears to value it. But the subject cannot just take the object away from the mediator. If he lives in a community, he must do what is socially appropriate. And that means he must pretend he is right to desire the object. He does this by inventing a reason why the mediator should be expelled from the community and then gathering allies with whom he can accomplish this. The authenticity of one's desires is a thing that one holds tightly to, indulging in all sorts of deceits to maintain its apparent legitimacy. But the truth is that our desires are based on jealousy and envy. Gathering allies allows one to maintain the fiction that one is objectively right in seeking to expel or kill the subject. The gathering of allies is what Gerard calls mimetic contagion. The group will soon forget the object and focus their attention on the mediator, an arbitrary victim they single out for expulsion or destruction. Once he is eliminated, the group will experience a period of calm or psychological relief. The victim subsequently becomes sacred to them, since he brought peace back. So remember in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the euphoric moment when the assassins bathed their hands in the blood of the dead Caesar. And if you know your history, you know that shortly after that, Julius Caesar is voted a god by act of Senate. Exactly what, and in fact, Gerard, an anthropologist, began as a scholar of Shakespeare. His first book was called Shakespeare, the Theatre of Envy, which you can't agree with everything he says in that book, but you know, the main point is good. It's a good one. So the mediator here has become that very interesting and crucially and culturally crucial figure, the scapegoat. This, what Gerard calls the scapegoat mechanism, and this very mechanism is what we see in action at the beginning of Sir Thomas Malory's last episode, where he describes the death of Arthur and the destruction of Camelot. And all, says Malory, was long upon two unhappy knights, which were named Sir Agravain and Sir Mordred. Both of these knights are brothers to Sir Gawain and therefore nephews to Arthur. But one of them, Mordred, is only Gawain's half-brother. Bit of court gossip for you here. When Arthur had first won his throne by conducting a war against King Lot of Lothian, Lot's wife came to Arthur at the victory feast and seduced him. By him she conceived a son, Mordred. It later turned out that Lot's wife was actually the daughter of Igraine and her former husband, the Duke of Tunisia. Arthur could not have known it, but he had slept with his own half-sister. Arthur's conception and his early reign thus have a dark side that comes home to roost in the closing chapters of the book. Although he's writing on a different text, he's writing about the alliterative Maud Arthur, Lee Patterson's comments are pertinent here when he writes that this is a myth of origins that deconstructs the origin. This dodgy origin story, remember Uther's rape of Igraine, transmits its instability to the future generation. The only real certainty becomes not a code of chivalry, but the iron law of recurrence. The present, Patterson concludes, is not a fulfillment of the past, but its reenactment. The sins of the father, Uther, have been visited upon his son. Malory observes that Agravain and Mordred had ever a privy heart unto the Queen, Dame Guinevere, and to Sir Lancelot. These two unhappy knights are the subjects. They desire something which belongs to another. I think it's important right away to note that this hatred is privy or private. This is not something that can come out into the open. It would reflect poorly on Agravain and Mordred. So they must pretend that the mediators, Lancelot and Guinevere, are worthy of expulsion by some objective code. And we do hear a couple of explanations that in their minds justify their actions. First, Agravain says, I marvel that we all be not ashamed both to say and to know how Sir Lancelot lawyeth daily and nightly by the Queen. This is what we might call the fictional or respectable reason for hating Lancelot and Guinevere. But Gawain, the older brother of Agravain and half-brother of Mordred, sees through this, sensing another motive, a privy motive for their hatred. The best of us all had been full cold at the heart root, had not Sir Lancelot been better than we. In other words, Mordred and Agravain envy Lancelot's prowess as a knight, an ability that impacts them more forcefully because they have themselves been rescued by him. In likewise, Sir Lancelot rescued you both, Gawain concludes. urging them to remember Lancelot's kindness. The object possessed by the mediator Lancelot and coveted by the subjects Agravain and Mordred is not a physical object, but Lancelot's personal qualities, his excellence as a knight. Agravain does not argue with Gawain. His cover has been blown, as it were, as a potential enactor of unsanctioned violence. The perpetrator can never defend himself with reason because envy is an emotional need. All he can really do is rationalize that need. Exposing the truth about his real motive would reveal the violent act he proposes to be profane, unsanctioned, whereas Agravain wants to be considered an actor of sacred violence. So he does not argue, but bluntly asserts, "Do as you list, for I will lend nor linger." Now, it will be objected right away, of course, that Lancelot and Guinevere are not actually innocent. Lancelot does, in fact, lie daily and nightly with the Queen, but they certainly do have structural innocence in the sense that Agravain does not really hate them for this, and will not admit his real reason for hating them, which is to say, jealousy. Nevertheless, the fact that they are guilty of adultery and therefore treason complicates the matter considerably. The fact is that no human being, and therefore no human sacrifice or scapegoat, is ever totally innocent. Everyone has sinned. That's part of the pattern we see developing through the Morte d'Arthur. This is what gives the scapegoat mechanism its apparent legitimacy. What we see from this episode is that human fallibility exposes them to scapegoating. And when those individuals are crucial to the survival of the community, as Lancelot and Guinevere are, then that community must perish with them. This is why the knights maintain the open secret so long. To reveal the sinful and treasonable relationship is to initiate the destruction of the Round Table. Another factor that complicates the issue is that of justice. Gerard argues that sacred violence does not quit a culture when it ceases to be primitive, his word. The justice system is simply sacred violence in another form. Witness all the ritual that attends legal proceedings, standing and sitting at the right moments, the regalia of the judge in some cases, the mysterious language, the fact that his business is conducted behind closed doors, in a kind of mystery and awe. And Arthur has always prided himself on his impartial justice. In an earlier episode, Malory had pointed out that such custom was used in those days. For favour, love, another affinity there should not be none other but righteous judgment, as well upon a king as upon a knight, and as well upon a queen as upon another poor lad. But here, unsanctioned violence, masquerading as sacred violence, has gotten out of hand and threatens the whole community. Thus, Arthur, cuckolded and betrayed as a husband, is nevertheless willing to remain quiet about their transgressions, as we saw earlier. Arthur thinks that if he sacrifices Lancelot and Guinevere on the altar of sacrificial justice, the cycle of violence will come to an end. Thus, he sanctions Mordred and Agravain, ambushing Lancelot and Guinevere to get the ocular proof of their infidelity. The ambush of Lancelot and Guinevere, incidentally, is a great example of mimetic contagion. Mordred and Agravain find another 12 disaffected knights to take part in trapping the lovers. But Lancelot escapes, killing the 12 knights and Agravain in the process. Using his system of impartial justice, Arthur has Guinevere tried and condemned to the stake. But at her execution, Lancelot turns up and rescues her, in the process killing Gareth, Gawain's younger brother. Gawain, who has been unmoved by the death of Agravain, finds his veneer of civilization finally scratched away and vows revenge upon Lancelot. We have moved once more to profane violence, bringing all of Arthur's efforts to naught. So in the end, it is unsanctioned violence that tears apart the Round Table. In a series of nightmarish battles, Arthur loses everything, lamenting that "Quains I might have in all, but such a fellowship of good knights shall never bear to get us in no company." Eventually he is brought to combat with Mordred, and each is slain by the other. Finally, Arthur realizes that he must return his sword Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake, who gave it to him, the veritable moistened boot, loving the scimitar. Giving it to the only surviving round table knight, Bedivere, he tells him to throw it into a lake. Bedivere at first refuses, but when he finally follows Arthur's command, a hand rises from the waters and catches it. Bedivere returns to Arthur to find him in the company of 9 ladies, who load him onto a barge and take him to Avalon to be healed of his wounds. Lancelot turns up too late to help, so he goes off seeking Guinevere. Now at last he thinks they can enjoy their erstwhile forbidden love. He finds her in the convent at Amesbury, having taken her vows as a Benedictine sister. They meet in the cloister, an area to which lay people were not supposed to have access. But you might remember Lancelot's knack of getting into places he ought not to get into. Guinevere swoons and recovering, tells him that she will not accompany him out of the convent. She has found another way, she advises him. To thy kingdom look thou turn again, and keep well thy realm from war and brach. For as well as I have loved thee heretofore, mine heart will not serve now to save thee. Her priority now is the preservation of peace, her goal to have a sight of the blessed face of Christ Jesus, and on that doomsday to sit on his right side, for as sinful that ever I was, now are saints in heaven. Rather than return to his realm, Lancelot chooses to enter a monastery himself. After a lifetime of prayer, fasting, and penance, Lancelot and Guinevere die. In death, Malory records that Lancelot lay as he had smiled, and the sweetest savour about him that ever they felt. The odour of sanctity, the pleasant smell reputed to linger about the corpses of recently deceased saints, is a sure sign that after a lifetime of violence and conflict, Guinevere and Lancelot have at last found the peace that passeth understanding. And that brings us to the end of the whole book of King Arthur and his noble knights of the Round Table. And I pray you all, ladies and gentlemen, listening to this lecture from its beginning to its ending, as you pray for Sir Thomas Malory's soul, pray also for mine. Thank you very much.